Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today is going to be another video in my American Society and Slavery series, where I discuss how Christians of the both liberal and theological spectrum, with Charles Hodge and Horace Bushnell being the proxies for that, and how everything sort of came together in American history from that. The influence of the evangelical movement in the antebellum United States was massive. 1 in 7 Americans belonged to a church, but evangelical ministers preached regularly to large crowds, and many of the ideas made their way into letters to ordinary Americans. Historians say that the piety promoted by religious rivals of the 18th and 19th century created an American identity more than anything else. The egalitarian dimensions came with evangelicals, which attracted many blacks at that time, and it did lead to activism against slavery. Pro-slavery evangelicals had to go against such a perfectionist movement in the church. Enlightenment encouraged an age of science, and thinkers trusted reason to discern laws which the universe ran, and distrusted truth claims based on religious tradition and supernatural revelation. They had ideals that struck placed high on human nature. They believed political liberty was the inherent nature of all human beings. However, there were pro-slavery Enlightenment thinkers who believed that common sense established black slaves were legitimate property and thus fell under Locke's life, liberty, and property philosophy, which made them not want to see slavery messed with. Enlightenment values on moderation made people compromise on slavery a lot, which entrenched the system more, as people didn't want to appear to be dogmatic. Some members of the Enlightenment claim that races were inherently unequal, as they had been created unequal and didn't have Adam and Eve as ancestors, as they were separately created. Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, and many anthropologists at the time believed in this polygenetic theory. The majority of Southern defenders of slavery did reject this, however. That didn't necessarily mean, though, that the people that rejected it were not racist, as even though they believed the races were created at the same time, environmental causes came in to make people different, and believed that black skin was a flaw that came from the result of poor environmental conditions. Romanticism wasn't as common as the other two traditions that I discussed in the previous video, but it was certainly present. It was largely a reaction against the Enlightenment, which proponents considered dull. They didn't hold lots of confidence on objective truth, but placed high value on subjective knowledge. Romantics viewed history as more of something to witness ideals actualizing themselves than gaining lessons from them, that being history. Some anti-slavery proponents used Romanticism to encourage empathy for slaves and said that history was a universal longing for freedom. Pro-slavery Romantics loved medieval cosmologies that advocated inequality as part of social order. They could use paternalism to justify slavery, and even anti-slavery opponents, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, pushed African geniuses as childlike. Moral arguments against slavery was like that of the emancipationist argument that basically argued slavery was evil but not a sin. It wasn't the kind of social relations humans were naturally created for. They believed in gradualism and moderationism, and Quakers were some of the first people to push it. Many of them hoped that American ideals and evangelical Christianity would render the practice obsolete. Some believed that slavery was like a war, an evil but sometimes a necessary one given certain circumstances, and that while blacks deserved freedom, they had to be weaned into it due to their inferior status. Abolitionists were more firebrand. William Lloyd Garrison was a pacifist who believed people just had to be shown the evils of slavery so that people would condemn it, and David Walker promoted violence to stop it. Garrison called the North to secede from the Union in order to get away from slaveholders. They were too diverse to be effective and were considered a fractious movement. Pro-slavery people made Unitarian arguments like John C. Calhoun, who advocated that slavery was a positive good that was good for everyone and that a Southern slave was cared for life, whereas Northerners were wage slaves that were discarded when they weren't useful anymore. John Henry Hammond made arguments like that. Blacks, according to them, benefited from slavery because it took them away from their heathen cultures and introduced them to civilization. Many secular writers were rallied by the Southern clergy, and writers like James Henry Thornwell and Thornton Stinchfellow argued abolitionists were the ones that brought the church into it, so they wouldn't have to make a political argument. Some people believe this sort of pro-slavery argument came from pre-revolutionary northern colonies, while others say it was a response to anti-slavery material in the 1820s by the South. While the curse of Ham comes up a lot, it should be noted that by the 19th century, many educated defenders of slavery dropped the positive argument that Africans literally bore said curse and were thus destined for slavery, but instead argued more broadly that it didn't contradict God's nature to destine a race of people for slavery. To quote David Torbett, "For all this, Southern clergy were not the vanguard of pro-slavery thought. Schooled in the evangelical tradition, they were more accustomed to speak of slavery as a necessary evil than a positive good. When James Smiley of Mississippi first preached his apology for slavery in the early 1830s, his fellow Southern clergy criticized him for failing to describe slavery as a necessary evil. Decades would pass before many Southern clergy could stand firmly behind his positive pro-slavery arguments. In fact, many clergy never entirely gave up the idea of gradual abolition. They just kept postponing appropriate future date. Charles Hodge maintained a consistent position in his own mind. He believed that involuntary servitude was okay, but that slavery as it was practiced in the South was inhumane and needed humanitarianism. He did oppose immediate emancipation, which put him at odds with many abolitionists, and he did harbor racial prejudices. His view on slavery was influenced heavily on his interpretation of the Bible. He had mostly servants, i.e. blacks, he bought for a short time period to help out around his house, and he probably seen himself as simply a temporary good owner of them. One servant he got for the equivalent of $2,353 in today's money, named Henrietta, served for 5 years. He paid her wages and let her leave when she wanted to. He purchased his mom's slave Lena's son so they could unite. Of course, it wasn't all nice, as he wouldn't have gotten them if they didn't advantage him in some way. What's funny is that none of his anti-slavery opponents brought up his personal slave owning, even though they criticized his moral views on the topic all the time. So even his critics must have thought it wasn't a big deal. He was still considered anti-slavery. Hodge's commonsensical approach to biblical interpretation was that there was things that could be known about Christ's incarnation but not understood, like how a scientist can know a great deal about how electricity behaves without knowing exactly what electricity is. A theologian can affirm a number of biblical mysteries without being able to explain them thoroughly. Hodge was a deontologist who believed in following right principles and that they shouldn't be forsaken for a good end. Divine will is revealed by our nature but fully affirmed with the Bible. In the next video, I will be going more over how this sort of interpretation worked with American life and how even Hodge applied it to certain matters, a bit of social interpretation. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.